My name is Ivo Ganchev, and I'm Adjunct Professor of Global Leadership at Beijing Union University. Today, I want to talk to you about gains from international trade, and in particular, I'll give you a perspective from economic theory. So before we get started, I want to introduce to you a few key definitions that you're going to see coming back to us throughout the talk. So first of all, we have the concept of comparative advantage. And this means the ability of an individual or group to carry out a particular economic activity, such as making a specific product, more efficiently than another activity. So that means, for instance, if you are a country, you might just be able to make items like, for instance, you might be able to make computers more efficiently or more quickly, or you might have a lot of natural metals or parts that go into computers, and you have an advantage over other countries. If you're an individual, similarly, it might mean that you're working more efficiently or you have more know-how in terms of making a specific product or offering a service. The second concept is a production possibility frontier, and this is a curve which depicts all of the maximum output possibilities for two goods given a set of inputs consisting of resources and other factors. In other words, these are the maximum numbers of different products that a certain country can produce given its labor force, given its natural endowments and conditions, and this gives you the production possibility frontier. The third concept is autarky, and this means, in simple terms, economic independence or self-sufficiency. For the purpose of today's lecture, what it means specifically is there is no trade. So remember, autarky means no trade. You can relate it in your mind to the word autonomous, for example, or autonomy, or auto, which means self, right? You're self-sufficient, you're independent, you're not trading. The final concept that I want to introduce to you is called the opportunity cost, the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. So to give you a simple example, you have time as a resource for yourself. And as you're watching this video, you are choosing to spend your time learning more about trade or more about economics. This means that you are losing the opportunity to do something else at the same time. You're losing the opportunity to maybe watch a movie, or maybe go out with a friend, or maybe do something more productive, like, for instance, go and find a job. So you're trading your time in this case to do something instead of another. Similarly, if you have a certain amount of resources, you might choose the type of product that you want to produce using these resources. And in this way, you lose the opportunity to use them in a different way. This is what we call opportunity cost. So where does comparative advantage come from? Especially when we speak about countries, when we speak about nations, it usually comes from one of these three factors: either technology, or natural resources, or cheap labor. So a country might have a specific strength in innovation, or a specific strength in innovation in a certain sector, in the way that Silicon Valley in the US has a strength in the computer and high-tech industry. A second source of a comparative advantage might be just natural endowments. So if you think of countries like, for instance, Ecuador, which is rich in oil, they just have a natural advantage over others because they have it. If you think of cheap labor, recently we've had this phenomenon in Asia, and now we've seen, for instance, a lot of factories in the last 1 or 2 years move from places like China, where salaries have gone up, to places like Malaysia and Vietnam, where salaries are still lower. So a comparative advantage also comes from cheap labor. Now this means that different countries have different strengths in terms of the goods and services that they can produce. For simplicity, we're going to focus on the production of fairly simple goods. So what I want to talk to you about today is the Ricardian, which is essentially the basic model of trade in economic theory. But before we do that, we need to make a few assumptions for the purpose of this talk. So first of all, we're going to assume that there are only two countries in the whole world, or at least in our world, in this talk, and they are going to be Brazil and the United States. Second, we're going to assume that Brazil and the United States produce only two goods. The first one is computers, and the second one is coffee. They don't produce any other goods, okay? The third assumption that we're going to make is only one input is required for the production of either computers or coffee, and that is labor. So we're not going to get into the details of what specifically you need to produce a computer or what you specifically need to produce coffee, because that's going to complicate the model. The next assumption that we're going to make is that the US and Brazil have an equal amount of active workers, so we're not going to give a specific advantage in terms of the number of workers to any of these two countries. And finally, we're going to assume that the total number of workers in the United States and Brazil are able to produce in 1 year the number of computers or kilograms of coffee depicted in the table that we are about to see in the next slide. So here is the table that gives us the basic idea of what we're going to be looking at. So the US can produce within 1 year 1,000 computers and 500 kilograms of coffee at most. And they have the following opportunity cost.
For every kilogram of coffee, they can produce 2 computers, or vice versa. For each 2 computers they produce, they sacrifice 1 kilogram of coffee. And that's if they choose to do it the other way around. Now, for Brazil, the highest that they can go is they simultaneously produce 500 computers and 1,000 kilograms of coffee within 1 year. So that means for every 2 kilograms of coffee, what they're sacrificing is 1 computer. And for each computer, they're sacrificing 2 kilograms of coffee. So let's see how this plays out in terms of a production possibility frontier.
So if we look at these two frontiers, the US on this side can choose to produce either 2,000 computers or 1,000 kilograms of coffee. Why? Because it has a certain opportunity cost to the production of coffee. So for each kilogram of coffee, it's going to sacrifice more than 1 computer, and vice versa. So if they choose to just stay in a state of autarky, if they choose not to trade, they can just produce along this line that you see here. They could be producing 2,000 computers or 1,000 kilograms of coffee, or they could be producing numbers somewhere in between. And if they choose to go in the middle, they can produce 1,000 computers and 500 kilograms of coffee, and as we saw in the table in the previous slide. Now for Brazil, the production possibility frontier is similar, but it's flipped because they have another type of opportunity cost and another type of comparative advantage. So Brazil can either produce 2,000 kilograms of coffee or 1,000 computers, or they can choose to stay somewhere within this production possibility frontier, meaning within this purple line that you see. So if they choose to produce both and not to trade under autarky, that means they could produce 500 computers and 1,000 kilograms of coffee. So essentially, the question here is, what is going to happen if they trade? And are they going to be better off if they trade, or are they going to be better off under autarky if they just choose to stay within their production possibility frontiers that you see on this slide? So let's see what happens when they actually trade. On top here, you see these two production possibility frontiers that you were familiar with from the previous slide. And at the bottom, what you see is a joint US and Brazil production possibility frontier. So essentially, let's imagine that the two countries can somehow, for instance, coordinate policy, okay? And they can decide that all they're going to produce is going to be computers. We can have 2,000 computers from the US, and we're going to have 1,000 computers from Brazil. This means that the most computers that they could jointly produce is 3,000. And the same goes for coffee. If we can choose to get 2,000 kilograms of coffee from Brazil and 1,000 kilograms of coffee from the US, then we're going to have 3,000 kilograms of coffee. But here is the question. What if we can decide to trade and to swap a kilogram of coffee for a computer because one of the countries is better at doing one of these things and the other one is better at doing the other one? Well, we can have this joint production possibility frontier here where they could actually trade and they could be better off if they choose to specialize, right? They could be better off and they could have 2,000 kilograms of coffee and 2,000 computers all together if they allow themselves to trade and to exchange one for one. Now, if you look at the gains that this gives to these countries, so for instance, you can see that the US initially was here within this purple production possibility frontier, but if you imagine that they trade with Brazil and they specialize in producing computers, they could move up here and choose to, for instance, keep 1,250 of their computers and swap 750 of them for coffee. And now they can have 1,250 computers and 750 kilograms of coffee, even though they use the same amount of labor. Similarly for Brazil, if they choose to specialize in the production of coffee and to trade coffee for computers, they could move from this point on the production possibility frontier from the purple line. They could move up here to this point that you see on the figure. And now they can have 750 computers and they can keep 1,250 kilograms of coffee that they produce themselves. So essentially what this means is that trade gives you greater gains than a production possibility frontier under autarky. And it means that this is why we trade internationally in theory. This is what the Ricardian model tells us. So why don't we always free trade then? This should be a simple question if you look at this Ricardian model. Well, some of you might actually say because we're not exchanging 1 kilogram of coffee for one computer. And of course that would be true. But there are also a lot of other reasons that are much more complex. So first of all, you have the idea of the destruction of home industries. So when you're making a national policy, you're trying to develop certain sectors sometimes that you might need for strategic reasons if we're talking about things like telecommunications, or you might actually need them because you want to employ a certain amount of people with these skills. So if you keep trading and you keep specializing, this means you lose your expertise in other industries. Another reason is that this type of free trade might be potentially harmful to developing economies. Now, if you're not exchanging 1 kilogram of coffee for one computer, but 1,000 kilograms of coffee for one computer, for example, then of course the trade production possibility frontier is going to look very different from what we saw on that Ricardian model. The third reason that some people are against free trade is that this leads to overdependence from other countries. So even if we assume that the Ricardian model works perfectly, if you stick to it, that would mean that your country will essentially develop an overdependence on relations with certain other countries because they're providing essential goods. And finally, you have the argument that there is an unrealistic assumption that workers can actually requalify or retrain. So there are certain industries that might essentially become irrelevant over time because of innovation and because we have new products coming up. And in this case, it's hard to retrain your workers and it's hard to actually switch to producing something new once you've been specializing for a long time. Because of these arguments against free trade, there are various ways in which states can limit trade, and they can use things like tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers that we're going to speak later in other talks. Now, based on our talk today, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you support free trade, why or why not. And what do you think is the difference between free trade and fair trade? Is free trade fair or is it unfair to some? And how so? Can you ensure that trade is always fair to everybody? And should you do that? These are questions that are being debated very frequently, and there are lively discussions on all of them in the academic community. So I hope that you can do some of your own research and get to know more about them. I'll see you in the next lecture.